Jerusalem, the Contested City. Lecture 3. The Fall and Restoration of Jerusalem.
We ended our last lecture discussing the Jerusalem of David and Solomon, a time when the city probably reached one of its apogees, one of its high points. It's still a very small place, and the glories of Solomon, which became almost proverbial, must be understood in the context of a very small kingdom surrounded by a number of very large kingdoms. With the death of Solomon, the history of Israel begins to take a downward turn, a dark and downward turn. But before we follow that trajectory, that downward trajectory, I should recall to you one more time that the evidence for everything that is being said here comes essentially from literary sources, or to put it another way, comes from the Bible. That we are now I've been talking about the books of Samuel, 1 and 2, the books of Kings, the books of Chronicles, where a great deal of this material comes from, because the historians of Israel were interested in the covenant and the way it worked out among the people, but they also had distinct political interests. They were interested in the monarchy and the unfolding of the history of the monarchy. But the monarchy comes to a kind of sad end, in a sense, or as I put it before, as to a downturn with the death of Solomon, that there is a disputed succession. And what happens, to put it very briefly, because we have to cover the material rather quickly, what happens is that there are two major problems which the Israelites don't manage to solve. One is the internal problem of a disputed succession, which finally tears the kingdom apart into a northern and a southern branch. And finally, the truly insoluble problem of Israel having far more powerful, far more aggressive neighbors than it can possibly handle. And that the combination of the two of them leads eventually down a couple of centuries in the future to the downfall of this Israelite state, to the loss of independence, and to living under the sovereignty of others, a situation which becomes very familiar to the Jews. As for the sources, to get back to that for a minute, the further we proceed chronologically, the more archaeology begins to play a role. There is no archaeology of Abraham or Moses in those earliest days, and even the archaeology of David and Solomon is a sort of a problematic piece of business. But as time passes, as we get closer to the classical era, the archaeological evidence, which lies closer to the surface, and maybe we're dealing with more realistic history, becomes a little bit firmer. It doesn't really demonstrate anything. It confirms some things, perhaps. There is currently a debate going on about the subject, the relationship of archaeology to the history of the Bible, and whether or not there is archaeological evidence for the Bible. And there are people who maintain, yes, there is confirmatory evidence of some types, and others who say, no, there really isn't, not until you get to a considerably later period. Well, to get back to the narrative, the main narrative line, the succession problem after the death of Solomon is so severe that this kingdom that David and Solomon ruled over as a single kingdom divides itself into a northern and a southern branch. The northern branch, which is centered in what is later called Samaria, and the southern branch, which centers in what is called Judea. One is the kingdom of Israel, the northern kingdom, and the other is the kingdom of Judah. Now, I must alert you at the very outset of this that the history of all of this is being written, as is typical, by the winners. The victors write history, and the victors in this case are the southern kingdom. So this whole narrative of northern versus southern kingdoms is written from the perspective of the southerners, the ones who composed or put together at least our Bible. So just be aware of that we're seeing it from a southern perspective. And the northern kingdom doesn't always come out looking very savory in this. The story that the Bible tells is one of almost unrelieved perfidy, infidelity, paganism, the inroads of Israel's neighbors into the community of the true faith in Yahweh. And it is particularly remarkable, of course, in the northern kingdom. That's where the emphasis on this Shekinah relies, and that it has to do very often, because it makes for a very interesting story, and as also experience bears this out, it has to do with foreign wives. Foreign wives, alien wives, or to put it bluntly, non-Jewish wives, non-Israelite wives at this stage, have a couple of effects. There is I guess, what could be called pillow idolatry, a phrase I just made up, which means the introduction of the gods of the wife into the temples of the husband. So this happens. The wife is imported from some remote place, or not so remote place, and brings with her her gods and her goddesses, her retainers, who are worshippers of those gods and goddesses, and they are established somewhere, depending on the sentiments of hubby, who seem to be particularly pliant in this. And that, of course, this story begins to repeat itself again and again in this northern kingdom. There's traces of it in the southern kingdom as well, until we get, of course, to the most notorious case of all, the famous Jezebel, right, whose name has become a sort of byword in English of a profligate and, let us say, a bad girl. Jezebel, of course, brought in her gods and goddesses with her and introduced them into the kingdom. And this is kind of typical of what goes on in the north with its capital at a place called Samaria, and which is later identified as Sebaste, the Roman settlement of Sebaste. But that's fine. That's part of the political history and the kind of tongue-clucking of the southern historians. But what is more significant, perhaps, from our point of view of Jerusalem, is that there is a rival to Jerusalem in Sebaste as the national capital, obviously, but there is even more of a rivalry from a religious point of view by the fact that there is a temple in the northern kingdom where they worship Yahweh. Right? They worship the same God, they have the same scripture, but they now worship in two different places. The northerners worship on Mount Gerizim, on their temple. Southerners worship God on Mount Moriah, or Sion, in Judea. So there are these two sort of rivalrous kingdoms, northern and southern, one sort of bad-mouthing the other, or each bad-mouthing the other. Meanwhile, off stage, while all of this is going on, all this kind of melodramatic stuff is going on, these successions of bad kings with the occasional good king thrown in, outside is the rise of a new generation of superpowers in the Middle East. Life is changing in the Middle East. There are kind of axial shifts that go on in the history of the Middle East, brought on by either new government forms or new technology or whatever. And one of the things that has arisen is a new generation of superpowers in the Middle East. Egypt was a constant source of problems for Israel, northern and southern branch. But in this case, the problem arose from Assyria. Assyria, which was located in what is today northern Iraq, was one of the rising new superpowers, and it based its primacy, really, rested upon the presence in the country of a professional army, one of the first we know of in Middle Eastern history. At any rate, by the 8th century, the Assyrians were beginning to make their moves. And the thing about Israel, northern and southern branch, is that they were not large enough or powerful enough to attract the immediate attention of either of their neighbors, either Assyria or Egypt, but they lay in the way between the two, so that any expansion of Egypt to the north and the east, or Assyria to the south and the west, is going to carry them into Israel. And in this case, it carried the Assyrians into Israel, and in 722, the Assyrians managed to overrun the northern kingdom of Israel with this capital at Samaria, and the Assyrians followed the policy that was fairly current at the time of deporting large sections of the population. People just simply skimmed off population as if they were part of the loot of the country, which in fact they were. Part of what we would call the assets of the country were taken off and taken into exile, resettled in their own land. And it's at this point, interestingly, that the 10 northern tribes of the Israelites simply disappear. They disappear off the stage of history. They are absorbed somehow into the population of Assyria. And the Assyrians, at a later stage, repopulated the area. Again, it's what is today called Samaria, or the West Bank. It corresponds to the West Bank, populated with their own people, to the point that the Samaritans, so-called, eventually were regarded by the southern citizens of the kingdom of Judah as not really Jews at all, that they were so intermarried that they were some sort of other hybrid, and that what the result of this is that a schism developed, a split developed between the Samaritans on the one hand and the kingdom of Judah on the other. And that schism has continued to the present day. There are still some Samaritans in existence, not very many of them, still centered around that same area, but they are not considered by the rest of the Jews as genuine Jews. So the Assyrians were a threat and managed to decimate half of what had once been the United Kingdom of Israel. So a large part of Solomon's kingdom had simply been chopped away by this superpower from the other side of the Fertile Crescent. Looking toward the south, looking to the kingdom of Judah, there are, as I said, a series of kings who seem to alternate between good guy, bad guy, as far as the kings were concerned. And one of the good guys was the king called Hezekiah, who reigned between 727 and 698 before the Common Era. He did what kings were expected to do during this era, at least the good kings were expected to do. He purified Jerusalem of the foreign cults that had constantly gotten footholds. Every time you turned your head, apparently, pagans began to creep into the temple precincts, temple prostitutes showed up, idols were introduced. It was a kind of ongoing problem in the 8th century and continuing. But Hezekiah purified them, got rid of them, and he also seems to be, by indirect evidence, seems to have patronized the literary arts, that he encouraged poetry and the production of a literature in Hebrew. But one of the really striking things about Hezekiah, and it appeals to us particularly because it's something that we can verify, we are told in the Bible that he assured the water supply of Jerusalem by building a tunnel to bring water into the city. Now, the water supply of Jerusalem at this stage was this spring that I mentioned in an earlier lecture called Gihon, which is located on the eastern side of that southern spur of the eastern hill called Mount Zion. And it's outside the walls. It's down at the foot of the terraces. So to get water, you've got to sort of get outside the fortifications. Not a happy idea. And so what Hezekiah conceived of is to try to build a tunnel, an underground tunnel, that would channel the water from the spring Gihon into some kind of secure reservoir inside the city walls of the small city walls of the former city of David, which he did. And there was a tunnel that was built. And in the 19th century, archaeologists digging around Jerusalem at a period when they were permitted to do so, sort of to their heart's content, discovered this tunnel and discovered it at both its ends, at the Gihon place where it began and at the Siloam end where it comes out, and discovered just inside the Siloam entrance the dedication inscription of Hezekiah in Hebrew, right, announcing the opening of this tunnel. And the extraordinary thing about the tunnel is that it's a serpentine tunnel. It curves underground from one place to the other. It doesn't go in a straight line. And these people channeled, or dug, I should say, through this rock from both ends and met in some eccentric place in the middle. How they accomplished it seems miraculous even to this day. But it was done, and it assured, at least for the time, the water supply of Jerusalem. So here's a place where archaeology, one of the places where archaeology can sort of verify something that the Bible tells us about. Hezekiah tried to shield Jerusalem from the Assyrians, who were continuing to proceed southward. I mean, they had swallowed up the northern kingdom and now obviously had designs on the southern. I shouldn't say they had designs on the southern kingdom. What these people were interested in were the temple treasures. I mean, the thing worth having were loot from these places, and most of the movable loot, non-human, non-personnel, was in the temple. The temple served as banks. They were highly decorated. They had lots of gold and silver, hammered gold and silver on them, and so that this is worth trying to get. So attacks on Jerusalem are really attacks trying to get hold of the goods of Solomon's temple. And Hezekiah was successful, but it looked like that there was finally that it was going to be the end of this, until the Assyrians, the king Sennacherib, who had come down like a sheep, like a wolf on the fold, as the poet later said. It looked like he was about to take Jerusalem, but in the last moment, God intervened. And God intervened by sending a plague upon the Assyrians, which decimated them, and they withdrew. That's not all of the story, of course. The kingdom of Judah continued to pay a tribute to the Assyrians, but the city at least was saved from sacking. Incidentally, this is a historic moment because it's the last time that God is recorded to have intervened that directly in Scripture. Right? Thereafter, God sends prophets and sends messages, but God is finished with this kind of direct intervention in the history of the Israelites. Passing on beyond Hezekiah, the next person probably worth noting for our purposes is the king Josiah, who ruled between 640 and 609 before the Common Era. And he is interesting from a religious point of view because, in a sense, he had Assyria off his back, not because of his doing, but because Assyria had simply collapsed under its own weight. It had reached the end of its lifespan. But there were others waiting for the Israelites. But what Josiah did was once again to get rid of the foreign cults in the temple. But more than that, in addition to cleaning out the temple, he centralized all of Jewish cult in Jerusalem, which means that henceforward the only place where sacrifice could be made to the Lord and that the priest could function was in Jerusalem. Right? Which is a remarkable move. Right? It's the only place where a Jew could worship the one true God, in the temple of Jerusalem. So the priesthoods were all summoned into Jerusalem and put to work there in the temple. And this is still the Temple of Solomon, obviously. And that in connection with this, the Bible tells us a story that during the reign of Hosea there was discovered a book in the temple called the Book of the Law, and which was somewhere in the archives of the temple, and modern scholars are intrigued by this. And now we're at the very beginning or the middle of the 7th century, and the suspicion is that this may be the last book that is collected into the Torah. It is called Deuteronomy, and the Greek words mean simply the second law, because it seems to be a kind of resume book of laws. It's quite different, not different in substance, but I mean there's a different tone and a different style that's going on in the book of Deuteronomy, and some people think that this book discovered by Josiah in the temple was the book of what later came to be called the Book of Deuteronomy, and was then included in the Torah, in the fixed Torah. These, as you can tell from the presentation, these are generally speaking bad times, very bad times, and that the clouds were darkening. The lights were going out all over Israel, and not to be lit until another generation, to take Mr. Gray's famous phrase about the First World War. But the lights going out in Israel was noted by any number of people. And these people were the prophets. That the Bible has a collection, an extraordinary collection of Israelite prophets who cluster around the notion of the sins of Israel and what's going to happen. And what they are the prophets of doom that is going to descend on Israel as a result of their of the sins that have been laid out in these books of Kings and Chronicles. That this has all been put down in great detail of how badly things are going. And so beginning with Amos and Hosea and Isaiah in the 8th century, these prophets, and continuing down through Jeremiah in the 7th and Ezekiel in the 6th century, there are these prophets who describe in extraordinarily graphic terms the sins of Israel and what is going to happen as a result of this. Right? This is going to be God's vengeance. This is God's justice that is being visited on Israel, and all of this is going to come to term in some destructive, extremely destructive way. And it turns out that the agents of God's justice against Israel and God's vengeance against Israel is the kingdom of Babylonia. And the Babylonians are, again, located, like the Assyrians, in what is today Iraq, but now in the central Iraq, north of the area of Baghdad. And they are Semites, like the Jews themselves, and they too are a powerful nation, and they take the place of the Assyrians in their aggressive marching back and forth between Egypt and Mesopotamia. This war of the superpowers goes on, and once again, Israel is caught in between. Right? It is simply the kind of carpet upon which these superpowers wipe their feet as they pass through on the way to greater game. And the Babylonians, what was going to happen was almost inevitable, that the powers of Israel clearly had been weakening. We're now talking really about the kingdom of Judah. Right? This tiny place had no real way of resisting the Babylonians, and in 597 the Babylonians overran the city and overran the temple, and they took their loot and they departed, but not for long. The Israelites, who even at this stage had a proud sort of feeling of independence, attempted a revolt against their Babylonian overlords, and the Babylonians were forced to return in 587, and the then king Nebuchadnezzar ordered the city to be stripped of its wealth and the land and the temple of whatever assets it possessed. And so thus began the deportation of the population, part of the population of Israel, and the carrying off of the valuables from the temple. The people that the Babylonians took into exile, of course, were not the peasants. They had their own supply of peasants. There was no need of carrying any more of them back to Babylonia. They took with the upper classes. They took the royalty. They took the king and the court. They took the priestly class. They took the artisans. They took the people they could use, the people who were of some sort of value to them, and left the rest behind. And probably not a very large number of people involved, but nonetheless, this is the cream of the crop of the kingdom of Judah. And as for the temple, they stripped off all the gold and silver, as one might expect, leaving not much behind. And I guess the most interesting thing that they removed from the temple was the famous Ark of the Covenant. Now, the Bible doesn't say anything about this, that it was removed, but the thing about this is that we never hear about it again. So we can only assume that the Ark of the Covenant, this central piece of Jewish religion, this token of the religion of the Israelites, was carried off with the Babylonians. Later legend, of course, had all sorts of stories about the Ark of the Covenant, that it was really sort of rescued from the temple at the last minute and put in a cave somewhere on the other side of the Jordan, etc., etc., none of which seems to have any sort of credibility. So, there were Judeans left behind, right? Some were left behind in Judea, the peasantry was left behind, and the others were taken to Babylonia, where they stayed from 587 down to the year 538, in which the Babylonians were replaced by a new dynasty of Persians, or Iranians, to call them more properly, and that the Shah, Cyrus, promulgated an edict in 538, which allowed whoever of the Jews wished to return to their home in the kingdom of Judah. Of course, it is no longer the kingdom of Judah. It is something else, as we shall see in a minute. Not everybody returned, right? And we don't know what the numbers were. But suffice it to say that there was a Jewish center, a Jewish population, a Jewish presence, community in Babylonia, all through its history, from the time they went there in 587 down to the 1950s of modern times. And this community of Jews in Babylonia / Iraq was extremely important in Jewish history. These are the authors of the Babylonian Talmud and many other aspects. Their influence was felt in many other places. And so this exile, this famous exile, the way it's presented in the Bible is that everybody comes back and they restore the life in Israel, which they do, but not everybody came back. And there is that Babylonian community. Anyway, our interest here is in Jerusalem, and so we're interested in the people who came back. What they came back to was a Persian province, right? We're talking about the Persian province of Yehud. So this is now no longer an independent Jewish state. It is part of a province of an empire. The thing about the Iranians is that unlike other conquerors, they didn't just strip the place and go back home. They annexed the territory into their own empire. They developed this system of provinces of an empire. They may be the pioneers in this, and that the Roman Empire is based on this kind of model later on, and all sorts of other later empires. They annexed this territory. And so Yehud, the province, was a province of that empire, a small province, a not particularly rich one. And the people who lived there began to be called the people of Yehud, which comes out in Greek as Judaioi and comes out in Latin as Judeoi. And these are the Judeans. So that from now on, the name that is given to these people, generally speaking, is Judeans, which in English eventually modifies itself into Jews. So the word Jew, or the designation Jew, comes from this post-exilic phenomenon of the Jews being synonymous with Judea. So when one is talking about the Jews in ancient literature, you never know if you're talking about a religious group or simply the inhabitants of Judea. A note about the sources here. We've now passed into the last historical books of the Bible. We've reached the end of the biblical line. We're in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. And Ezra and Nehemiah describe the return from exile and the attempt to reestablish a Jewish commonwealth of some kind, or a Jewish community, I should say, under these circumstances. And so they had to rebuild. There's an attempt to rebuild the foundations of Jewish life. The land is populated in many instances by squatters, some of them the local peasantry left behind, other cases outsiders, Arabs and others who had moved in and just simply expropriated this empty land. They had to be cleared out, they had to be sort of subjugated, and that they had to adjust, the newcomers, the returnees had to adjust to a new life as a part of the province of somebody else's empire, in this case the Persians. One thing they did is they renewed the covenant. That's one of the famous scenes in the book of Ezra where the Israelites collect in the public square in Jerusalem, and the covenant, the law, as the book says, is read out to them, and they all respond at the end with amen, thereby signifying their fidelity to the law. What is interesting about it is read out, but then it is translated for them into Aramaic, because these people had by now lost their Hebrew. They no longer spoke the language. They spoke Aramaic, and that became the language of the Jews subsequently for a very long time, until they began to speak Arabic much, much later. They also attempted to restore the city and the community. The walls of Jerusalem had to be rebuilt. If there's only way of protecting a place, you have to wall the city. You can't live in an open settlement. You're just a prey to anybody who passes by. So Nehemiah, who seemed to be the governor of the place, reconstructed the walls of the city, and commercial life now began to resume try to pick up the pieces of the commercial life of the place. But what emerges out of this is that, yes, the commercial life, but also there's some sort of attention is being given to try to restore this as a Jewish state. The Iranians didn't much care how you lived, as long as you paid your taxes in their provinces, and as long as you didn't have any, what we would say, foreign policy of your own, you could live pretty much the way you want to. And that was the way also that the Greeks and the Romans generally after them felt the same way about a lot of their subjects. You could follow whatever set of laws you wanted, unless you were a Roman citizen or a Greek citizen. So the Jews lived under their own law, which in this case is the law of Moses. That's the law of the land. They still have a Persian governor, they still have to pay taxes, but they live under their own law. And so these returning Jews, as we may now call them, began to try to put into place some version of their law to restore the law. And we know about a couple of instances of this. One is that the attempt to enforce the laws governing the Sabbath. The Sabbath prohibits, I should say, any sort of mercantile, any sort of work on that particular day. It's a day of rest from all sorts of things, including work. So commerce has to be severely regulated on that day as a form of work. And that this new polity here in the province of Yehud tried to regulate this, tried to enforce some of the Sabbath laws. And incidentally, an ongoing problem in any version of a Jewish state is how much should the state attempt to enforce the observance of the religious law. And in this case, there was some attempt to do this, and perhaps even more in a more drastic fashion, it was decreed that all of those Israelites, Jews now, Judeans, who had returned, had to get rid of their foreign wives, foreign being a synonym for non-Jewish wives, and the offspring of them, right? Got to get rid of the children as well, because by Jewish law, these were not Jews. These were not Israelites. These were not Judeans from a religious point of view. And so the wives and the kiddies, not to over-dramatize it, were sent packing. Now, this is an attempt to sort of restore the boundaries, the religious boundaries of the community, right? And this was all part of the post-return from exile attempt to pull the community together, to make some sort of, to restore the integrity somehow of the community. And finally, these Judeans/Jews undertook in the year 516 of the common, before the Common Era, under the priest and the man who served briefly as the governor of Yehud, a man by the name of Zerubbabel, to rebuild the house of God. Right? The house of God had been destroyed by the Babylonians. There wasn't much left of that. Again, archaeology is of no help here. As we'll see later on, King Herod had pretty much paved over that entire area. But they rebuilt, the Judeans, they rebuilt a temple, presumably on the same spot that Solomon had built his. We have very little idea of what it was like, except there are occasional little hints that it was not, that it compared rather poorly, to put it in a charitable way. It compared poorly to Solomon's edifice. As we can well imagine, the resources of this tiny province were not the resources of the kingdom of Solomon, and the craftsmen were not the same, and the outside funding which Solomon had was not the same. And so this so-called Second Temple, right, the one that is connected with the name of Zerubbabel, was nothing like the original construction. And the Jews then had to turn and face whatever it was that the future held for them in their newly established place in Judea. The future, as it turned out, was not entirely bright, but it was certainly exciting.
After listening to Lecture 3, a student posed this question to Professor Peters. What happened to the 10 lost tribes of Israel? Let's listen to the professor's response.
The so-called 10 lost tribes of Israel have been the subject of a great deal of speculation, of course. There's really no trace. They're gone. They were there before the Assyrians came, and then they were no longer there. We will hear from them again, however, if we can last long enough. Part of the end-time scenario in Judaism and in Christianity as well, which uses the same script in a sense, is that the ingathering of Israel, including the return of the lost 10 tribes. There were 2 tribes that were survivors, the tribe of Judah and the tribe of Benjamin, who constituted the southern or kingdom of Judah. But the other 10, without a trace, except in mythology and legend.
This ends Lecture 3.